"He knows the truth," a little street urchin yelled, pointing at the millionaire's son. Then the kid hands him a note, and when he reads it, he bursts into tears upon discovering something shocking. The shout sliced through the heavy afternoon air like a razor, echoing across the cobblestone streets of the historic town at precisely 3 o'clock. Jasper Cartwright, a 52-year-old widowed millionaire who owned one of the largest construction companies in the region, nearly dropped his coffee mug as he backed away from the window of his luxury condo. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the weathered clapboard house across the street, a faded yellow 2-story structure with peeling blue window frames that clashed with the sleek elegance of his modern building. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, straightening his tie before returning to work. As a businessman who had amassed his fortune investing in the stock market and diversifying his assets, he was accustomed to solving complex problems, but he preferred to keep his distance from other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone. Ever since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. Across the street, inside the clapboard house, 4-year-old Maisie huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her few years insufficient to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman gripped a metal spoon tightly, having heated it on the electric stove, her eyes bloodshot from the cheap beer she'd been drinking since noon at the local dive bar. "You're a curse on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the alcohol. "Because of you, my sister's gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the child's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars dotting her thin limbs. Maisie bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screams only enraged her aunt more, who used to work at City Hall, until she was fired for excessive absences caused by her addiction. The child closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice singing that lullaby before bedtime. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop whining," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you smudge the walls again with that dirty charcoal, you'll see what real punishment is." Maisie ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old twin bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up under the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she was cooking, a folk song about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the clapboard house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, the millionaire felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest. Something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. Next door to the clapboard house, retired schoolteacher Beatrice Abernathy, aged 61, was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. "That's odd," she thought, observing the windows of the neighboring house. A family she had known for decades. The aunt had always been troubled, but since she had taken custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the atmosphere of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in the historic town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The following morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had spoken to her properly, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little child better. Meanwhile, the businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a former employee who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before his wife's accident. She was a kind woman, always humming while organizing the construction company's files. Then suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought of her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to suffer in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains that surrounded the town as Maisie finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers gripped the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, Jasper closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell over the historic town, but the echo of that childish song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running from his responsibilities and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore a child's suffering. The following morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical bustle of the town awakening for another day. Beatrice put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the clapboard house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a swollen face and bloodshot eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," Beatrice said with her kindest smile. "I've come to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper chat." The aunt hesitated, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Beatrice, It's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The educator took a step forward, forcing the woman to back away. "And I would love to meet your niece. I hear she's a lovely girl." The aunt's face hardened for an instant before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is sick. High fever. Best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. Beatrice pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Perhaps I can help," Beatrice insisted. "I have experience with sick children. Raised 3 of my own, you know how it is." "No need, no," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I've already taken her to the doctor. It's just a cold. It'll pass soon." Beatrice noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades dealing with troubled families. Across the street, Jasper watched the scene from his window while eating breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confusing dreams where the voice of a child mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw Beatrice at the door of the clapboard house, a strange curiosity washed over him. Beatrice finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an inquisitive glance into the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the clapboard house, the aunt slammed the door shut and went to the kitchen, where she found Maisie crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the woman growled, her irritation intensified by her hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Auntie," Maisie murmured, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the backyard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." Maisie went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high fences and dominated by a single mango tree. There, she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the electric stove. It was always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving Maisie in the yard under the strong midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So, she began to hum her mother's lullaby, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached Jasper's ears again. This time, he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He took out his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee hummed that same song while she worked. The woman who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. The woman who always spoke fondly about her little girl, a girl named Maisie, Jasper murmured, the cell phone trembling in his hands. His former employee's daughter was named that. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How had he not made this connection before? The millionaire put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his condo. He vaguely remembered his former employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties, but he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the troubles at the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now 5 years later, the woman's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she was not in a good situation. The guilt that Jasper carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped his employee when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock, sharp, the screams started again. This time, Jasper didn't turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as, through the kitchen window of the clapboard house, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He took out his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It appeared to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently towards a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time Jasper couldn't pretend that they were just childhood tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? His business mind, accustomed to making quick decisions involving millions in investments and financial applications, was now paralyzed by a situation that involved something much more valuable than money. It was a human life, a helpless child who had been left in the care of someone completely unsuitable. Jasper thought of his own wealth, of how he had accumulated capital through years of hard work, of how his assets and net worth gave him the power to solve problems. But this situation demanded something that money couldn't buy, courage to act when a child needed protection. That night, Maisie slept on the ground in the yard, where her aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the mango tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent request to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, Jasper couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's passing. The recordings on his cell phone were concrete evidence, but he knew that using this evidence would mean taking on responsibilities that he had avoided for years. 3 days had passed since Jasper discovered Maisie's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. That Thursday morning, Beatrice Abernathy made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just a few yards from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and they were all present in the neighboring clapboard house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting another direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the location from which she had the best view of the backyard of the clapboard house. What she saw horrified her. Maisie was sitting under the mango tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing in the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that Beatrice recognized as birds. "Good heavens," the educator whispered, her hands trembling as she held onto the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined. Much worse. Maisie looked up and saw the woman watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to Beatrice's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," Maisie said with her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly women. "Hi, sweetheart," Beatrice responded, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you all right?" Maisie glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "That's pretty. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," the child replied, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Where are you, girl?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything Beatrice needed to know. Maisie got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that cried out for help. Beatrice remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend that she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, Jasper had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the neighbor's backyard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt a genuine fury burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if, indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable condo, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, Beatrice made a courageous decision. She put on her best business attire, picked up a tray of homemade cookies that she had prepared as a pretext, and headed to the clapboard house again. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "Beatrice, I already told you it's not a good time. Honey, I brought some cookies that I made yesterday," the educator interrupted firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little one better. As old neighbours, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, Beatrice had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the clapboard house was gloomy and smelled of mould mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," the aunt lied, "blocking the way to the back of the house." "That's a shame." "Maybe another time then," Beatrice said. But her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that appeared to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and above all, small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. Beatrice and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbour's cat," the aunt said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The educator smiled and nodded, but had decided that she had seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always right next door if you need anything at all." Beatrice's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the educator left, the aunt slammed the door shut and went to the kitchen, where she found Maisie huddled behind the electric stove, trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard Beatrice's kind voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," the aunt accused, her eyes already shining with the familiar fury. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," Maisie protested, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt picked up the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. Maisie recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to get attention, don't you?" the woman hissed as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here and ask questions. You think I can't take care of you." Across the street, Jasper had positioned his cell phone at the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. His wealth, built through years of investing in funds and diversified applications, gave him the power to do something. But more than that, his conscience was finally screaming louder than his fears. As Maisie suffered another episode of systematic torture, the millionaire made a call that he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend Roberto. "Roberto, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the child's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it could be a matter of life or death." That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, Maisie managed to sneak out into the backyard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the mango tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's lullaby softly. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering. Jasper had spent the entire night on the phone with his lawyer, explaining the situation and sending the recordings by email. By morning, a legal action would be initiated, but there was another movement happening simultaneously. Beatrice, unable to sleep after what she had witnessed, had also made her own calls. Using her contacts from her teaching days, she had contacted social workers and the competent authorities. What neither of the adults knew was that their independent actions were about to intersect in a way that would not only change the girl's life, but also reveal secrets that had been buried for 5 years. The connection between Jasper and his former employee was much deeper than he imagined. and the truth about what really happened to the child's mother was about to come to light. In the darkness of the backyard, Maisie continued to sing, unaware that her life was about to change forever and that the coming days would bring revelations that would explain why she had been abandoned and who was truly responsible for her suffering. Roberto arrived at Jasper's condo on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been college classmates almost 3 decades ago, and Roberto knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the previous night had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," Roberto said, sitting down in the spacious living room of the condo. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." Jasper poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being abused by the aunt who takes care of her." "Abused how?" Roberto asked, taking a notepad out of his briefcase. "Burns. Daily screaming. Neglect." Jasper paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, Roberto. Evidence of what's happening." Roberto was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," Jasper replied, running his hands over his face. "But there's something more. My former employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before my wife's accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," Roberto completed, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. Jasper nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have needed to leave her daughter with that woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and Roberto could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "This happens every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 o'clock religiously, but sometimes also at other times," Jasper replied, picking up his cell phone. "Want to see the recordings?" Roberto watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention across the street, Maisie lived another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning. "How many times do I have to tell you not to smudge the walls?" the woman shouted, holding the girl by the arm with enough force to leave marks. "You're a pest, a curse on this house," Maisie tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone. But the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," the aunt continued, pushing the child down the hall. The room where Maisie was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this song that Beatrice heard as she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the backyard, about the marks she had seen on the child's arms. She stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but filled with a sadness that made Beatrice's heart break. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, she went directly to the city center, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the counselor well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "Anna, I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," Beatrice said, entering the office without ceremony. The counselor looked up from the papers she was analyzing. "Beatrice, it's good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger. My neighbor. I'm sure she's being abused." The employee straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years as a Child Protective Services counselor, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and Beatrice was not the type of person to make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," Anna said, picking up a complaint form. While the educator related her observations, across town, Roberto was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. D.A. Lucas listened attentively as Roberto presented the evidence collected by Jasper. "This is compelling evidence," the DA said, examining the videos on Roberto's cell phone. "I'm going to order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will that take?" Roberto asked, concerned. "With this evidence, we can act today," Lucas replied. "I'm going to contact Child Protective Services now." It was thus that, by a coincidence that would change Maisie's destiny, 2 simultaneous complaints reached Child Protective Services on the same morning. Anna was finishing writing down Beatrice's account when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services, Anna speaking." "Anna, this is D.A. Lucas. I need you to make an urgent intervention. We have evidence of serious child abuse." Anna paused, the pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by any chance at the yellow clapboard house on Main Street?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," Anna replied, looking at Beatrice with surprise. "2 independent sources. This confirms the gravity of the situation." By 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. Anna, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading to the Clapboard house. Beatrice had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. Jasper watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. Roberto was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change Maisie's life forever. "You did the right thing," Roberto said, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," the millionaire replied, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the clapboard house. In the house, the aunt had left to buy alcohol at the local dive, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued to hum softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When Anna knocked on the door of the clapboard house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in all the rooms. It was Beatrice who first heard the weak voice coming from the room in the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team down the hall. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl huddled in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their hearts. The child raised her big, frightened eyes, not understanding who these people were. "Hi, honey," Anna said, crouching down to be at the child's level. "My name is Anna. We've come to help you." The girl looked at Beatrice, recognizing the kind woman who had spoken to her in the backyard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes. "Auntie will be mad," she whispered. "You don't need to worry about that now," the educator said, extending her hand to the girl. "We're going to get out of here, okay?" And so, after months of silent suffering, the girl was finally removed from the house where she had known only pain and fear. But the biggest revelation was yet to come. 3 days later, when the legal procedures were being organized, Roberto made a discovery that would change everything. Investigating the documents of Jasper's former employee, he discovered something extraordinary. She had left a sealed letter to be opened only in case of an emergency involving her daughter. The letter revealed the devastating truth. The employee had not abandoned her job due to family problems. She had discovered a serious irregularity in the company's accounting books, involving embezzlement of funds destined for a social project. Fearing retaliation, she had collected evidence and hidden it, planning to report everything to the authorities. But before she could act, she was threatened by a corrupt partner of Jasper's, a man he had fired years later for suspected misconduct. The employee was forced to choose between her safety and that of her daughter, or to remain silent. She chose to protect the child, resigning and promising never to reveal what she knew. The final tragedy came when, months later, she suffered an accident that took her away from her daughter forever, leaving the child in the care of her troubled sister, who took out all her bitterness on the innocent niece. When Jasper learned the truth, his guilt turned into determination. Using his fortune and influence, he not only ensured that the girl was placed under his temporary care, but also that the aunt was permanently removed and received adequate treatment for alcoholism. On the last day of summer, 6 months after the first time he heard those screams, the millionaire was in the garden of his estate, watching the girl play. She had gained weight, her wounds had healed, and for the first time in a long time, her smile was genuine. "Uncle," she called him, running towards him with a drawing in her hand. "Look what I did." It was a bird, but this time it wasn't flying away. It was perched on a tree, surrounded by a family of other birds. Beatrice, who now visited regularly to help with the child's education, smiled as she saw the drawing. "She doesn't draw birds running away anymore," the educator observed. "Now she draws birds that have found their home." Jasper hugged the girl, finally understanding that all his wealth, all his investments and assets only had true value when used to protect those who needed it most. The child who had lost everything had found a new family, and he had found a purpose that went far beyond accumulating capital. The yellow clapboard house was transformed into a shelter for children at risk, fully funded by the millionaire. And every afternoon at 3 o'clock, instead of screams of pain, what was heard were the laughter of children playing safely. The girl would never have to sing her mother's song alone again. Now she had a whole family to sing along with her.